When I got promoted, my husband's aunt sneered, "They must have lowered the standards." My mother-in-law nodded. "Or raised something else." The table chuckled. Then the CEO's wife stood calm but cold. "Interesting, given what just landed on my desk about your nephew. Shall we discuss it now?" "So they finally gave you a real job." Stephanie's voice cut through the restaurant chatter before I'd even sat down. Not congratulations. Not excitement. Just that tone she reserved for discussing things that shouldn't have happened. Grant pulled out my chair, whispering, "Just ignore her." But we both knew ignoring Stephanie was like ignoring a hurricane. I settled into my seat at Bella Vista, the kind of upscale restaurant where Stephanie felt most comfortable. Expensive enough to remind everyone of her status, intimate enough for her barbed comments to land with precision. The white tablecloth was pristine. The crystal glasses caught the dim lighting perfectly, and I already felt underdressed despite wearing my best blazer. "Regional director," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's actually a significant promotion. I'll be overseeing the entire West Coast division." Before we continue, I want to thank you for being here as we explore stories about earned success and workplace respect. If you believe merit should matter more than connections, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women facing similar challenges. Now let's see how this unfolds. Haley looked up from her menu with that practiced smile she wore when she was about to say something cruel. "How wonderful for you, dear. Though I have to ask, what happened to the person who had the job before? Did they retire? Get transferred?" The question hung there, loaded with implication. I knew what she was really asking. What quota needed filling that made them choose you? "The position was created specifically for our expansion," I explained, hating how defensive I sounded. "Our division has grown by 30% over the past 18 months, and they needed someone to manage the increased workload." 30%, Stephanie repeated as if testing the numbers for accuracy. "That's impressive. Of course, growth is easier when you start from nothing, isn't it?" Grant's hand found mine under the table, a gentle squeeze that was supposed to be reassuring. But his silence spoke louder than his touch. 3 years of family dinners, 3 years of comments like this, and he'd never once told them to stop. The waiter appeared with wine glasses, and Stephanie ordered a bottle without consulting the table. "The Chateauneuf du Pape," she said, pronouncing it with the kind of perfect accent that reminded everyone she'd studied abroad in college. "I think we need something special for this occasion." I'd been preparing for this dinner all week. I'd practiced how I'd tell them about the promotion, imagined their surprised faces when they realized the temporary girlfriend had accomplished something significant. I'd even bought a new blouse, navy blue, professional but not intimidating. Now it felt like costume jewelry at a diamond exhibition. "You know," Haley said, unfolding her napkin with deliberate care, "I was just talking to my book club about how different the workplace is now. So many opportunities for people who might not have had them before. It's really quite progressive." The words hit their target perfectly. People who might not have had them before. Translation: people like me from backgrounds like mine who went to state schools and worked their way through night classes while others were handed everything on silver platters. "Merit-based promotion has always been the standard in my company," I said, surprised by the steel in my own voice. "They don't hand out director positions as participation trophies." Stephanie's eyebrows rose slightly, the only sign that my response had registered. "Of course not, dear. I'm sure you worked very hard. Though I do wonder about the competition these days. Standards seem so flexible compared to when my generation was building careers." "Aunt Stephanie," Grant finally spoke, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's not really fair. You don't know the details of her promotion." "Oh, but I do know the company," Stephanie replied smoothly. "Richardson Industries, isn't it? I've heard wonderful things about their diversity initiatives. Very forward-thinking. Nicole Richardson speaks at our charity luncheons sometimes. Lovely woman, very committed to inclusion." The way she said inclusion made it sound like a disease. I gripped my water glass tighter, watching the condensation drip onto the white tablecloth like tiny tears. "Actually," Haley leaned forward conspiratorially, "speaking of Richardson Industries, did you hear about Dylan's promotion? Stephanie's nephew," she added for my benefit, as if I hadn't heard them brag about him at every family gathering for the past 6 months. "Youngest junior analyst they've ever hired." straight from his master's program to a corner office. It's not a corner office, Stephanie corrected with false modesty, though her smile betrayed her pride. But it is impressive for someone his age. 24 and already making strategic decisions. Some people just have natural leadership qualities. Natural leadership qualities. Not hard work. Not dedication. Not the kind of grinding, relentless effort it took to earn an MBA while working full-time. Just natural gifts. The kind that apparently skipped over people like me. Dylan's so brilliant, Haley continued. Top of his class, internships at Fortune 500 companies, recommendation letters from professors who specifically requested him for research projects. It's refreshing to see someone who's truly earned their position. The implication was crystal clear. Dylan had earned his position. I had been given mine. Grant shifted uncomfortably, but his silence was deafening. This was the moment I needed him to defend me, to tell them about the late nights I'd spent studying while he watched television, to mention the client presentations I'd delivered that had resulted in million-dollar contracts. Instead, he focused on his bread plate as if it contained the secrets of the universe. Not everyone's built to juggle work and home responsibilities, Haley said, her voice taking on that syrupy tone she used when delivering her cruelest observations. Some of us understand that a woman's real success comes from creating a harmonious home environment. Making sure her husband feels supported and valued. The words landed like physical blows. Every late night I'd spent studying, every weekend I'd worked instead of attending Grant's golf tournaments, every sacrifice I'd made to build something of my own. All of it was being reframed as selfish ambition that made me a failure as a woman. A woman's true success, Stephanie added, raising her wine glass in a mock toast, is measured by how happy and fulfilled her husband looks. How well she manages her priorities. I looked at Grant, searching his face for any sign that he disagreed with their assessment. His jaw was tight, but he said nothing. 3 years of marriage, and he was still more afraid of disappointing his aunt than defending his wife. The restaurant felt smaller suddenly, the warm lighting too bright, the conversations at other tables too loud. I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to collect myself before I said something I couldn't take back. Standing in front of the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. When had I become someone who apologized for her accomplishments? When had I started believing that maybe they were right? When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to Dylan's recent work projects. Stephanie was describing his innovative approach to client relations while Haley nodded approvingly. They spoke about him with the kind of respect and admiration I'd never heard them use about anyone else's achievements. That's when Nicole Richardson stood up. I'd barely noticed her during dinner. Nicole was always quiet at these gatherings, content to listen while others dominated the conversation. As the CEO's wife, she commanded automatic respect, but she rarely inserted herself into family drama. She was elegant in a way that didn't need to announce itself. Understated jewelry, perfect posture, and an air of confidence that came from genuine accomplishment rather than inherited status. Interesting timing for this conversation, Nicole said, her voice cutting through the chatter with surgical precision. Especially given what just landed on my desk this afternoon about your nephew Dylan. The temperature at our table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Stephanie's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. Haley's confident smile flickered like a candle in wind. Nicole's eyes moved slowly around the table before settling on me. There was something in her expression, not pity but recognition. Like she'd been watching this entire performance and had seen enough. Dylan, she repeated, letting the name hang in the air like smoke. Your brilliant nephew who's been working in our junior analyst program. The one you've been praising so enthusiastically. Stephanie's voice came out as barely a whisper. What about Dylan? Nicole's smile was sharp as glass. Oh, I think that's a conversation better suited for a more private setting. Don't you agree? The shift in power was immediate and undeniable. Suddenly, Stephanie and Haley looked very small in their expensive chairs, and I felt something I hadn't experienced all evening, anticipation. The Monday after that disastrous dinner, I walked into Richardson Industries with a different kind of focus. Nicole's cryptic comment about Dylan echoed in my mind as I settled into my cubicle, surrounded by the familiar hum of keyboards and coffee makers. My colleagues had already started their morning routines, but I found myself studying the office layout with fresh eyes. Dylan's workspace sat in the corner, glass-walled and pristine. The junior analyst corner office that Haley had mentioned, though she'd exaggerated about the corner part. Still, for someone barely a year into the company, he had an impressive setup. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a standing desk, 2 monitors, and enough space for client meetings. The kind of workspace I'd dreamed about during my first 5 years here. "Coffee's fresh," called Marcus from the break room. "And congratulations on the promotion, Director." The title still felt surreal. Regional Director. 6 months ago, I'd been managing 3 accounts and hoping for a team lead position. Now I oversaw the entire West Coast operation. The rapid advancement had surprised everyone, including me. But sitting here now, watching Dylan arrive fashionably late in his designer suit, I wondered if my success was somehow connected to whatever Nicole knew. My computer chimed with a calendar reminder. Quarterly compliance review. Perfect timing. I'd volunteered to assist with the year-end reconciliations 3 months ago, partly out of genuine interest and partly because it gave me access to departments I'd never seen before. The compliance office sat 2 floors up, in a sterile wing where numbers lived and died by decimal points. "Morning, Sarah," greeted Janet from compliance. "Ready to dive into the fun stuff?" Janet was being sarcastic. Compliance work was notorious for being mind-numbing, endless spreadsheets, receipt matching, and expense report verification. Most people avoided it. But I'd always found patterns soothing, numbers reassuring in their honesty. Unlike people, numbers didn't lie unless someone made them. The first stack of files contained routine expenses. Hotel receipts, client dinners, conference fees. Standard business costs that painted predictable pictures of professional life. But Dylan's file felt different from the moment I opened it. The first anomaly jumped out immediately. A dinner receipt from Lou Bernardine in New York. $300 for 2 people. Expensive but not unusual for client entertainment. Except the date was September 15th and Dylan's travel calendar showed him in Los Angeles that entire week. I cross-referenced his submitted timesheets. No travel authorization for New York. No client meetings scheduled. I flagged it mentally and continued reading. Another restaurant receipt, this time from Chicago. Again, no corresponding travel records. Then a hotel bill from Seattle during a week when he'd charged hours for being in the San Francisco office. "Finding anything interesting?" Janet asked, glancing over my shoulder. "Just the usual discrepancies," I replied casually. "Some travel receipts that don't match the timesheets. Probably just filing errors." But they weren't filing errors. As I dug deeper, a pattern emerged. Dylan was submitting legitimate receipts, but they weren't his. The signatures on credit card slips belonged to different people. The dates and locations never aligned with his actual schedule. Someone was feeding him these receipts and he was claiming them as business expenses. My phone buzzed with a text from Grant. "Lunch today? Want to talk about last night?" I ignored it. Last night's humiliation felt secondary now, overshadowed by what I was discovering in these files. Dylan wasn't just incompetent, he was actively defrauding the company. And if Nicole already knew something, these expense irregularities might be the tip of a much larger iceberg. The second red flag appeared in his vendor payments. Dylan had approval authority for purchases under $5,000, standard for junior analysts. But his approved vendors included companies I'd never heard of. Pacific Consulting Solutions, West Coast Analytics Group, Mountain View Strategic Services. All registered addresses led to mail drops and virtual offices. I pulled up the invoices. The work descriptions were vague. Strategic market analysis, competitive research deliverables, client retention consultation. But the billing patterns were identical. Same invoice templates. Same payment terms. Same grammatical errors in the service descriptions. "Janet," I called over. "Can you show me how to access vendor registration information?" "Sure thing. Though most of that's handled automatically through our procurement system." She pulled up the database and I searched for Pacific Consulting Solutions. Incorporated 6 months ago. Single employee. Business address matched a strip mall in San Jose. The registration listed Dylan's personal email as the primary contact. My pulse quickened. Dylan wasn't just submitting fake expenses, he was creating shell companies and paying himself for services that didn't exist. The amounts were small enough to avoid triggering automatic audits, but over time they added up to significant money. A shadow fell across my desk. I looked up to find Dylan himself standing there, coffee in hand and that easy smile that had charmed his way into this position. "Hey there," he said, his voice carrying that casual confidence that came from never having to worry about consequences. "Heard you got promoted. Pretty impressive for someone who started in customer service." The dig was subtle but unmistakable. He knew my background, knew I'd worked my way up from the bottom. Unlike him, with his supposedly prestigious degree and family connections. "Thanks," I replied evenly. "Just trying to make sure everything runs smoothly. Speaking of which, I've been reviewing some expense reports for compliance. Mind if I ask about this dinner receipt from Lou Bernardine?" I held up the paper, watching his face carefully. For just a moment his confident mask slipped. His eyes darted to the receipt, then back to my face, calculating. "Oh, that old thing. Client dinner with the Peterson account. Must have mixed up my travel dates in the system." "The Peterson account is based in Portland," I said quietly. "This receipt is from New York." Dylan's laugh was too loud for the morning office atmosphere. "You know how crazy travel gets. Sometimes I'm juggling so many cities I can barely keep track. I'll have my assistant update the records." He didn't have an assistant. Junior analysts never did. But I just nodded and filed the receipt back in its folder. "No worries. Just trying to keep everything organized." After he walked away, I noticed his hands had been shaking slightly. That polished confidence was more fragile than he wanted people to believe. I spent my lunch break in my car, creating a private folder on my personal cloud drive. Screenshots of the vendor registrations, photos of the suspicious receipts, timestamps of Dylan's calendar discrepancies. Each piece of evidence was small by itself, but together they painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. The metadata discovery came by accident. Dylan had emailed me a quarterly analysis report, accidentally including my address in a mass distribution. The file looked professional: charts, graphs, detailed market projections. But when I opened the document properties, the original author was listed as someone named Jennifer Walsh. The creation date was 3 years old, last modified 2 days ago. I searched for Jennifer Walsh in our company directory. Former employee, departed 18 months ago. Senior analyst who'd worked in competitive intelligence. I pulled up her old reports from the archive system and found the original document, identical to what Dylan had just submitted as his own work. He wasn't just stealing money. He was stealing ideas, research, and entire reports from former colleagues. The scope of his deception was breathtaking. That evening, I sat in my apartment with all the evidence spread across my dining table. Receipts, screenshots, metadata logs, vendor registrations. A complete picture of fraud that had been happening right under everyone's noses for almost a year. I could have reported it immediately. Could have called HR, sent everything to compliance, exposed Dylan before he could do more damage. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Stephanie's voice saying they'd lowered the standards. Maybe it was Haley's implication that I hadn't earned my promotion. Or maybe it was the realization that this wasn't just about Dylan anymore. This was about every person who'd ever assumed I didn't belong, who'd dismissed my accomplishments, who'd made me feel like an imposter in my own success. I closed the laptop and locked the evidence away. Not yet. When I revealed what Dylan had been doing, it would be at exactly the right moment in exactly the right way. Nicole's comment had shown me that the perfect opportunity was coming. I just had to be patient and keep watching. 2 weeks later, I was still carrying Dylan's secrets like stones in my chest. The evidence sat locked in my personal files, but the weight of it followed me everywhere. To morning meetings where he presented stolen research, to lunch breaks where he charmed senior staff with borrowed insights, to evening commutes where I replayed every fraudulent detail. Grant noticed my distraction during dinner on a rainy Thursday night. We'd ordered Thai takeout and I was mechanically moving pad Thai around my plate while my mind wandered through vendor registrations and forged receipts. "You've been quiet lately," he said, refilling his beer from the bottle we kept in the fridge. "Everything okay at work?" The question felt loaded. Grant rarely asked about my job beyond surface pleasantries. His sudden interest made my shoulders tense. "Just busy with the new role," I replied, taking a careful bite. "Learning the systems, understanding the scope of responsibility." "Right. Your promotion." He said it like he was still processing the information. "Dylan mentioned he barely sees you around the office anymore. Says you've been spending time with compliance." My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Dylan had noticed my investigation. Worse, he'd mentioned it to Grant. The web of family connections was tighter than I'd realized. Compliance work is part of regional oversight, I said evenly. Making sure everything runs smoothly across departments. Grant nodded, but something shifted in his expression. Dylan's doing really well there. His supervisor mentioned he might be up for another promotion soon. Kid's got natural talent. Natural talent. The same phrase Stephanie and Haley had used at dinner. I wondered if Grant genuinely believed it or if he was repeating family talking points. How did Dylan get the job anyway? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. It's such a competitive company. He was lucky to land something right out of graduate school. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Family connections. It's normal in business. He's smart enough to handle it. But how exactly did the connection work? Did Stephanie know someone? Did you put in a word? Why are you asking so many questions? Grant's voice carried an edge I rarely heard. Dylan earned his position. He had excellent references, strong academic performance. The family connection just helped him get noticed. The defensiveness in his tone set off alarm bells. Grant was hiding something and his discomfort was making him sloppy. I'm just curious about the process, I pressed gently. Maybe I can help other people in my network understand how to leverage connections effectively. Drop it. Grant's words came out sharper than intended. Don't go digging into family business. Dylan's doing fine and that's all that matters. The warning was clear, but it also confirmed my suspicions. Grant knew more about Dylan's hiring than he was admitting. After dinner, while he watched television, I retreated to our home office under the pretense of catching up on work emails. Our shared computer sat in the corner, an older desktop we mainly used for printing documents and storing photos. Grant handled most of our household administration from this machine. Bills, insurance forms, tax documents. If he'd helped Dylan with anything job-related, traces would be here. I pulled up the printer history, expecting to find the usual mix of utility bills and bank statements. Instead, I found something that made my blood freeze. 3 PDF documents, printed 2 weeks ago. The timestamps showed 11:47 p.m., 11:52 p.m. and 11:55 p.m., late enough that Grant thought I was asleep. The file names were clinical. Reference .pdf, reference .pdf, and recommendation .pdf. My hands trembled as I opened the first document. A glowing reference letter for Dylan Richardson, praising his analytical skills and work ethic during his internship at Thomson Strategic Consulting. The letterhead looked professional, the language was convincing, and the signature appeared authentic. Except Thomson Strategic Consulting didn't exist. I'd seen the name in Dylan's expense reports, one of the shell companies he'd created to funnel money to himself. Now I understood the full scope of the deception. Dylan hadn't just stolen from Richardson Industries after being hired. He'd lied his way into the position using fake references. The second letter was even more audacious. A recommendation from Douglas Morrison, supposedly Dylan's supervisor during a summer internship at Morrison Financial Group. The letter detailed specific projects Dylan had completed, clients he'd impressed, and leadership potential he'd demonstrated. But Douglas Morrison had retired 5 years ago, and Morrison Financial Group had been acquired by a larger firm 3 years before Dylan's supposed internship. The third document was the most personal betrayal. A reference from Jennifer Henderson, praising Dylan's research abilities and attention to detail during his work as a graduate research assistant. Jennifer Henderson was real. She was Grant's former colleague from his brief stint in academia before switching to sales. But she'd never worked with Dylan, never supervised students, and according to her LinkedIn profile, she'd been working overseas during the time period mentioned in the letter. I sat staring at the screen trying to process what I was seeing. Grant hadn't just helped Dylan fabricate references. He'd involved his own professional contacts in the deception. He'd forged Jennifer's signature, stolen her credentials, and used her reputation to vouch for lies. The worst part was the technical sophistication. These weren't crude forgeries. The letterheads were pixel perfect, the formatting was professional, and the language matched each supposed organization's communication style. Grant had invested serious time and effort into this deception. I printed fresh copies of all 3 documents, then checked the browser history. Grant had visited multiple websites, logo galleries for design inspiration, academic writing guides for proper recommendation language, even tutorials on PDF editing software. He'd researched this project like a graduate thesis. A sound from the living room made me close the browser quickly. Grant was getting up for another beer and I didn't want him finding me at the computer. I slipped the printed references into a folder and returned to the couch, my mind racing with implications. "Everything okay?" Grant asked, settling back into his recliner. "Just checking emails," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal. "You know how it is with the new position. Always something that needs attention." He nodded, but I caught him glancing toward the office door. "You should probably start setting boundaries. Don't want work taking over your whole life." The irony was staggering. Grant was lecturing me about professional ethics while he'd spent weeks crafting fraudulent documents to advance Dylan's career. The same man who'd never offered to help with my own job search, who discouraged me from applying to competitive positions because he thought I'd be disappointed, had moved heaven and earth to get his cousin an undeserved opportunity. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling while Grant slept peacefully beside me. 3 years of marriage and I was learning that I'd never really known him at all. He wasn't just passively supporting Dylan's lies, he was actively orchestrating them. The next morning I scanned all 3 reference letters and uploaded them to my secure cloud drive. Then I cleared the printer history, deleted the browser cache and removed any trace of my discovery. If Grant checked the computer later, he'd find nothing suspicious. But I kept thinking about Jennifer Henderson. Grant had dragged an innocent person into this mess, using her name and reputation without permission. That crossed a line beyond family loyalty into something darker. I found Jennifer's contact information through Grant's old work files and sent her a carefully worded email, asking if she'd recently provided any references for job candidates. Her response came within hours. She hadn't written a recommendation letter in over 2 years and certainly hadn't heard of Dylan Richardson. The confirmation felt like a final puzzle piece clicking into place. I now had proof of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. More importantly, I had evidence that tied directly back to my own husband. I created a new email account using a generic name and composed a message to Nicole Richardson. The subject line was simple: Audit Committee Document Review Request. I attached the 3 forged reference letters along with screenshots of their metadata, showing they'd been created recently despite their supposed dates. The message itself was brief. These documents were used in a recent hiring decision. The metadata and digital signatures merit closer examination, particularly given the IP address origins and the current employment status of the supposed authors. I sent the email from a coffee shop across town, using their public Wi-Fi to ensure no digital trail led back to me. Then I deleted the account and went home to wait. Justice was no longer just coming. It was already in motion. 3 days after I sent that anonymous email, the invitation arrived. Richardson Industries' annual Leadership Recognition Gala. My name was printed in elegant script under regional directors to be honored. The thick cardstock felt substantial in my hands, official proof that my promotion wasn't just some diversity quota-filling exercise that Stephanie had implied. Grant found the invitation on our kitchen counter and picked it up with the kind of reluctance people reserve for jury duty notices. "These things are just for show," he muttered, setting it back down without reading the details. Bunch of executives patting themselves on the back while everyone pretends to care about corporate achievements. His dismissal stung more than it should have. This was the first time in my career I'd been honored at a company-wide event, the first time my professional accomplishments warranted formal recognition. I'd imagined Grant being proud, maybe even excited to see me receive acknowledgement for years of hard work. "It's important to me," I said quietly. "I'd like you to come." He sighed and picked up his coffee mug. "Fine. But I'm not wearing a tuxedo to watch people give speeches about synergy and market penetration." The night of the gala, I chose my navy dress carefully. It was the same one Stephanie had criticized at a family wedding 2 years ago, calling it too businesslike for a party, and suggesting I needed to learn the difference between boardroom attire and social events. Tonight it felt like armor. The ballroom at the Fairmont Hotel was decorated in Richardson Industries' corporate colors, deep blues and silver that caught the chandelier light. Round tables filled the space, each draped in white linens and centered with understated floral arrangements. The honored employees sat at the front tables, while family members and other guests filled the back half of the room. I spotted Stephanie and Haley immediately. They'd claimed a table near the bar, strategically positioned to observe the entire room while maintaining easy access to cocktails. Both wore designer dresses that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and both had already started their commentary about other guests' fashion choices. "There's Dylan's family," Grant said, waving in their direction. "We should go say hello." I followed reluctantly, knowing this encounter was inevitable but dreading the familiar dynamic. Stephanie greeted Grant with air kisses and gave me a polite nod that felt more like an acknowledgement of an unwelcome obligation. "Well, look who's being honored tonight," Haley said, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness that always preceded something cruel. "You've got your little title now, huh? Regional director sounds so official." The way she said little made it clear she considered my promotion insignificant. I forced a smile and thanked her, refusing to let her diminish this moment. "You know," Stephanie added, settling into her chair with the grace of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "some of us prefer raising real leaders rather than chasing corporate titles. Like Dylan. That boy has natural executive presence. Born for leadership." I bit my tongue hard enough to taste copper. Dylan was supposed to be at the gala. Junior analysts were invited to these events, but his chair remained empty. A small part of me wondered if my anonymous tip had already reached the right people. Across the room I caught Nicole Richardson's eye. She was seated at the head table with other executives and their spouses, elegant in a way that didn't need to announce itself. She gave me a subtle nod of acknowledgement, and something in her expression suggested she remembered our brief interaction at that disastrous family dinner. The evening progressed through the standard corporate event routine. Welcome cocktails, dinner service, and speeches from various department heads about quarterly achievements and strategic initiatives. I found myself relaxing as colleagues congratulated me on the promotion, sharing stories about challenges they'd overcome and goals they'd set for the coming year. "Your department's growth numbers are impressive," said Robert Chin from the marketing division. 30% increase in client retention, 45% revenue growth. That's the kind of performance that gets noticed at the executive level. The validation felt genuine, based on measurable results rather than family connections or perceived quotas. For the first time in weeks, I remembered why I'd fought so hard for this position. But the peace didn't last long. As the dinner plates were cleared and dessert arrived, Stephanie's voice carried across our table. "It's such a shame Dylan couldn't make it tonight," she announced to no one in particular. "He had some urgent client matter that required his attention. That's the mark of a dedicated professional, putting client needs above personal recognition." Haley nodded approvingly. Unlike some people who prioritize their own advancement over actual results. The barb was clearly aimed at me, suggesting that my presence at the gala represented selfish ambition rather than earned recognition. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat but said nothing to defend me. His silence had become a constant backdrop to these family interactions. The keynote speaker was finishing his remarks about innovation and leadership when Nicole Richardson stood up. The room gradually quieted as people noticed the CEO's wife approaching the podium. She wasn't scheduled to speak, but her presence commanded immediate attention. "Before we conclude tonight's celebration," Nicole began, her voice carrying clearly through the sound system, "I need to address something important that has recently come to our attention." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This wasn't part of the planned program, and the shift in Nicole's tone suggested serious business rather than congratulatory remarks. "Our company's success depends on integrity, transparency, and the merit-based advancement of qualified professionals," she continued, her eyes scanning the room before settling on our table. "Unfortunately, we've discovered evidence of fraudulent credentials and misrepresented qualifications within our organization." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Stephanie's wine glass froze halfway to her lips, and Haley's confident smile flickered like a candle in wind. Nicole placed a manila folder on the podium, the gesture deliberate and ominous. Forged reference letters, fabricated work experience, and misrepresented educational achievements. These violations of trust and professional ethics will be investigated thoroughly, beginning Monday morning. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the audience. The individual in question has been suspended pending a full internal review. We will also be examining how such fraudulent materials were created and who may have assisted in their preparation. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. This was my anonymous tip bearing fruit, but hearing it announced publicly made the consequences feel suddenly real and irreversible. Stephanie's face had gone completely pale, the color draining so rapidly she looked ill. Her hands trembled as she set down her glass, and I saw her glance frantically toward the exit doors. The integrity of our hiring process is paramount, Nicole continued. We owe it to our legitimate employees, those who have earned their positions through hard work, education, and genuine qualifications, to ensure that fraudulent actors cannot undermine our standards. The word legitimate hit like a physical blow to Stephanie and Haley. All their comments about quotas and lowered standards were being turned back on them, revealing that the real threat to company integrity came from their own family. Grant's hand found mine under the table, but his grip felt desperate rather than supportive. When I looked at his face, I saw fear mixed with something that might have been guilt. Nicole's final words carried the weight of a judicial pronouncement. An internal investigation will examine all aspects of this fraud, including any external parties who may have participated in creating false documents. We take these violations extremely seriously. She returned to her seat amid stunned silence. The planned closing remarks felt anticlimactic after her bombshell announcement, and guests began filtering toward the exits earlier than usual. As we waited for the valet to bring our car, Grant finally broke the silence that had surrounded us since Nicole's speech. "You did this, didn't you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but the accusation was unmistakable. I turned toward the hotel's bright windows, watching the city lights blur past taxis and town cars. I didn't owe him an explanation. He'd made his choice when he decided to help Dylan forge those reference letters. When he'd prioritized family loyalty over professional ethics. When he'd remained silent through years of his relatives' dismissive comments about my accomplishments. I simply made sure the truth came to light, I said finally. You made your choice. I made mine louder. The valet brought our car and we drove home in complete silence. But for the first time in our marriage, the quiet felt like victory rather than defeat. Monday morning arrived like a storm I'd been watching approach for weeks. I dressed carefully for work, choosing a charcoal blazer that projected confidence without seeming celebratory. Walking into Richardson Industries, I could feel the shift in atmosphere immediately. Whispered conversations that stopped when I passed, curious glances from colleagues who'd heard rumors but didn't know details. Dylan's corner office stood empty, his computer monitor dark, his standing desk cleared of everything except a lone coffee mug with the company logo. The security badge scanner would have rejected his credentials at 6 a.m. sharp. Nicole's investigation moving with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Heard about the suspension, Marcus said quietly as we waited for the elevator. Compliance was here before 7 this morning, boxing up files from his workspace. Must be serious. I nodded non-committally, not trusting myself to comment. The elevator doors opened and we rode to the 5th floor in thoughtful silence. My phone rang before I'd even reached my desk. Grant's ringtone, a simple chime I'd never bothered to customize, filled the air. They suspended Dylan, he said without preamble, his voice tight with stress. Stephanie's been calling me since 6 this morning. She wants to know what's happening. I imagine she does, I replied, settling into my chair and powering up my computer. This is serious. They're talking about a full investigation. Internal audit, HR review, the whole thing. Grant's breathing sounded shallow, like he'd been pacing. Stephanie thinks someone at the company has it out for Dylan. She's convinced this is political. The irony was breathtaking. Stephanie, who'd spent years dismissing other people's achievements as quota-filling and standard-lowering, was now claiming her nephew was the victim of workplace politics. Maybe they found something worth investigating, I said carefully. You don't understand. If they dig deep enough they'll find. Grant stopped himself, but the admission hung in the air between us. They'll find what, Grant? Silence stretched for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I helped him with some of the application materials. Just a little assistance with formatting and language. Nothing major. The lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Formatting and language assistance didn't require creating shell companies or forging references from retired professionals. But Grant was still trying to minimize his involvement even to himself. I need to get to work, I said. I'm sure Dylan will sort everything out if there's been a misunderstanding. I hung up before he could respond, my hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. The morning passed in a blur of emails and client calls, but I could sense the investigation machinery grinding into motion around me. HR representatives moved through the building with folders and laptops, their presence creating ripples of speculation and concern. Around 11, my direct supervisor knocked on my cubicle wall. Sarah? Nicole Richardson would like to see you in the executive conference room. Now if possible. My stomach dropped, even though I'd been expecting this conversation. I followed him through corridors I rarely traveled, past offices with mahogany furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic city views. Nicole sat alone at the head of a glass conference table, a stack of documents spread before her. She gestured for me to take a seat, her expression unreadable. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice carrying the same authority that had commanded the gala audience. "I wanted to discuss recent developments regarding Dylan Richardson's employment." I waited, keeping my expression neutral. "Our investigation has uncovered extensive fraud," Nicole continued. "Fabricated educational credentials, forged reference letters, and stolen intellectual property. The scope is quite remarkable, actually." She opened a folder and withdrew a familiar document, one of Dylan's fake reference letters. This particular letter claims to be from Douglas Morrison at Morrison Financial Group. But Morrison retired 5 years ago, and the company was acquired 3 years before the supposed internship dates. Nicole's eyes met mine. The digital fingerprints on this document trace back to a residential IP address in your neighborhood. My pulse quickened, but I maintained eye contact. That's concerning. Indeed. Particularly since the homeowner at that address has a personal connection to Dylan Richardson. Nicole paused, studying my reaction. The investigation team will be contacting Grant Richardson later today to discuss his involvement in creating these fraudulent materials. The confirmation hit like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting it. Grant's careful lies and desperate deflection couldn't protect him from digital evidence and metadata trails. "I appreciate you keeping me informed," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Nicole leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly. "I also wanted to thank you for bringing this matter to our attention. The anonymous tip we received was thorough and professionally presented." I kept my face carefully blank, neither confirming nor denying involvement. "Fraud like this damages everyone who legitimately earns their position," Nicole continued. "It undermines trust, creates unfair advantages, and ultimately hurts the people who play by the rules." Her words felt like validation I hadn't realized I needed. For months, I'd questioned whether exposing Dylan was the right choice, whether I was acting out of petty jealousy or genuine principle. Nicole's assessment confirmed what I'd known all along. This wasn't about personal grievances. It was about protecting the integrity that made achievements meaningful. "Grant Richardson has been asked to resign from his current position," Nicole said matter-of-factly. "The company he works for takes ethics violations seriously, particularly when they involve falsifying professional references." I nodded, absorbing the information without surprise. Grant's employer had clearly been contacted as part of the investigation's expanding scope. "Thank you for the update," I said. "I should probably get back to my department." "Of course. And Sarah?" Nicole's voice carried a note of warmth I hadn't heard before. "Congratulations again on your promotion. It's well-deserved." I returned to my desk with mixed emotions, relief that the truth was finally surfacing, but also a strange sadness about the relationships that were crumbling in its wake. Grant had made his choices, but the consequences would reshape both our lives in ways I was only beginning to understand. My phone rang again an hour later. This time it was Stephanie. "How could you do this to family?" Her voice was shrill with accusation and panic. "Dylan is a good boy. He made a few mistakes, but you've destroyed his entire future." "I didn't destroy anything," I replied calmly. "I simply made sure the truth came to light." "You're a bitter woman who couldn't stand seeing someone else succeed," Stephanie spat. "You've always resented Dylan's natural abilities, his education, his potential. This is nothing but jealousy disguised as righteousness." The familiar accusations bounced off me like rain on glass. After years of absorbing their criticism and self-doubt, I finally understood that their opinions reflected their own insecurities rather than any truth about my character or capabilities. I didn't do this out of jealousy, I said, my voice steady and clear. I did it because I earned everything I have through honest work and legitimate qualifications. And I won't let anyone take that from me or diminish what it means. Stephanie's silence stretched for several seconds before she hung up without another word. Grant came home that evening subdued and defeated. He'd been asked to resign from his sales position, effective immediately. The investigation had revealed his role in creating the forged references, and his employer couldn't risk association with document fraud. 3 years, he said, slumping into his recliner. 3 years of building relationships, meeting quotas, earning commissions. Gone because I tried to help family. I didn't respond. Grant had chosen to help Dylan by breaking every ethical rule he'd ever claimed to respect. The consequences were entirely predictable and completely deserved. We spent the evening in separate rooms, the weight of unspoken accusations and destroyed trust making conversation impossible. Grant retreated to his home office to make phone calls about severance packages and unemployment benefits, while I prepared for another day of work where my promotion felt increasingly solid and legitimate. A week later, I found a note on the kitchen counter next to Grant's house key. I can't stay here knowing you destroyed my family's future. I'm staying with my brother until I figure out what comes next. I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished. The note was signed simply Grant, without the usual endearments that had punctuated our correspondence for 6 years. I stood in the quiet kitchen, holding the tea that symbolized the end of my marriage, and waited for the tears or regret or crushing sadness that should have accompanied such a moment. Instead, I felt nothing but profound peace. The next morning, I went to work with my head held high, walking through corridors that finally felt like they belonged to me as much as anyone else. 2 weeks passed in a rhythm I'd forgotten existed. Quiet mornings with coffee and news, lunch breaks where nobody questioned my choices, evenings where the only voice in my apartment was my own. I'd started leaving work at reasonable hours, no longer feeling guilty about boundaries I'd never been allowed to set. The email from Nicole came on a Tuesday. Coffee this week? I'd like to discuss some opportunities. We met at a small cafe near the office, the kind of place with exposed brick walls and mismatched vintage furniture that felt deliberately unpretentious. Nicole arrived first, claiming a table by the window where afternoon sunlight filtered through sheer curtains. "Thank you for making time," she said as I settled into the chair across from her. "I know this has been an eventful few weeks." That was an understatement. Dylan's termination had been finalized the previous Friday, his access to company systems permanently revoked. The investigation had uncovered fraud totaling nearly $80,000 in fake expenses and shell company payments. Grant's role in the reference letter scheme had resulted in potential criminal charges, though his lawyer was negotiating a plea agreement. "I've been watching how you've handled everything," Nicole continued, stirring honey into her tea. "The way you carry yourself through difficult circumstances. There's a quiet strength there that's rare in corporate environments." I sipped my latte, unsure how to respond to such direct praise. Compliments felt unfamiliar after years of subtle criticism and qualified acknowledgments. "You didn't just protect your own position," Nicole said. "You protected the integrity of our entire hiring process. Companies live or die by trust. From clients, from investors, from employees who need to believe that merit still matters." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a cream-colored envelope with my name written in elegant script. "The board met yesterday," Nicole said, sliding the envelope across the small table. "We'd like to offer you a new position." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the envelope. The letterhead was embossed, the language formal and official. Senior Strategic Analyst, reporting directly to the CEO's office. A 30% salary increase, equity participation, and oversight of cross-departmental initiatives. "This isn't a reward for exposing Dylan," Nicole clarified, reading my expression. "It's recognition of how you handled a complex situation. No drama. No public accusations. Just careful documentation and appropriate channels. That kind of judgment is exactly what we need in senior leadership." The offer felt surreal. 6 months ago, I'd been fighting for recognition as a regional director. Now I was being asked to join the executive leadership team, to help shape company strategy rather than simply implement it. "I understand if you need time to consider," Nicole said. It's a significant step up in responsibility. I don't need time, I replied, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I accept. Nicole smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd ever seen from her. Excellent. You start Monday. We'll have your new office ready by then. The apartment hunting began that weekend. I'd been living in Grant's house since our marriage, a suburban colonial that reflected his tastes more than mine. The rooms were too large, the colors too neutral, the whole space designed for entertaining people I no longer wanted to see. I found my new place on the third day of searching. A one-bedroom loft in a converted warehouse downtown. Exposed brick walls, original hardwood floors, and windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. The rent was higher than I'd ever paid before, but my new salary made it comfortable rather than stressful. It's small, the real estate agent warned, as if I might not have noticed. It's perfect, I replied, already imagining how the morning light would fill the space. Moving day was surprisingly emotional. I packed only what truly belonged to me. Clothes, books, a few pieces of furniture I'd bought before marriage. Everything else stayed behind, symbols of a life that had never quite felt authentic. The hardest decision was the wedding photos. I found them in a box in our bedroom closet, images of a woman who looked like me but seemed like a stranger. She was smiling in every picture, but the joy looked forced, performed for cameras and families who'd never quite accepted her presence. I left them in the box and closed the closet door. My sister Rachel drove up from San Diego to help with the move, the first time we'd spent more than a phone call together in 3 years. Grant had always found excuses to avoid her visits, claiming her energy was too intense for his comfort. I like this place, Rachel said, setting down a box of kitchen supplies in my new space. It feels like you. What do you mean? Honest. No pretense. Just clean lines and good light. She gestured toward the windows. Remember how you used to paint? You always said you needed natural light for color accuracy. I'd forgotten that detail, one of many pieces of myself that had gotten lost during marriage. The easel was still in Grant's garage, covered with dust and neglect. I bought it back, I admitted, along with some canvases and paints. Thought I might try again. Rachel's face lit up with genuine delight. Good. You were talented. Still are, probably. That evening, after Rachel had driven home and the last box was unpacked, I sat in my new living room with a glass of wine and called my parents. I hadn't told them about the separation yet, hadn't figured out how to explain the complexity of what had happened. Honey, are you okay? My mother asked immediately. You sound different. I'm getting divorced, I said simply. And I got promoted to senior management. And I moved into my own place downtown. The silence stretched long enough that I checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. That's a lot of changes, my father said finally. Are you sure you're making the right decisions? For the first time in months, I laughed out loud. Dad, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. The conversation lasted 2 hours, filled with questions I'd been preparing to answer and support I hadn't expected to receive. They'd never particularly warmed to Grant, I learned, but had kept their opinions private out of respect for my choices. He always seemed to think he was doing you a favor by being with you, my mother said. That's not how healthy relationships work. Monday morning arrived with the crisp energy of new beginnings. My corner office on the executive floor had windows facing both east and south, flooding the space with light that reminded me of my new apartment. A nameplate on the door read, Sarah Matthews, Senior Strategic Analyst, in brass letters that caught the hallway lighting. Nicole knocked on my door frame around 10, carrying 2 cups of coffee. How's the first day treating you? She asked, settling into one of my new chairs. Like coming home, I replied, and meant it completely. The work was challenging in ways that felt energizing rather than exhausting. Strategic planning, cross-departmental coordination, and executive briefings that required the kind of analytical thinking I'd always enjoyed. For the first time in my career, I felt like my capabilities were being fully utilized rather than carefully contained. The painting started slowly. Weekend afternoons when natural light filled my apartment and silence allowed for focus I'd forgotten was possible. Watercolor landscapes at first, then abstract pieces that emerged from instinct rather than planning. My hands remembered skills I thought I'd lost, muscle memory returning like a dormant language suddenly spoken again. Dylan's criminal charges were finalized 3 months later. Fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. His plea agreement included restitution payments and community service, but no jail time. Stephanie sent a letter to my office, blaming me for destroying her nephew's future and demanding I contact the prosecutor to minimize the charges. I threw the letter away without responding. Grant's situation resolved more quietly. His plea agreement included probation and a fine, along with a permanent note in his professional record that would make future employment in sales nearly impossible. He'd moved back in with his brother and taken a job at a hardware store, his corporate career effectively over. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no vindictive pleasure in his consequences. He'd made choices that led inevitably to specific results. I'd simply stopped protecting him from the natural outcomes of his decisions. The final vindication came 6 months later, during Richardson Industries' annual board meeting. Nicole introduced me as one of 3 senior analysts whose strategic recommendations had increased company efficiency by 12% and client satisfaction scores by 18%. These are the results we see when we prioritize merit-based advancement and ethical leadership, she told the assembled executives. Talent rises to its appropriate level when given genuine opportunity. Sitting in that boardroom surrounded by people who respected my opinions and valued my contributions, I realized that my promotion had never been the real victory. The victory was becoming someone who didn't need external validation to know her own worth. Someone who could stand up for principles without apology. Someone who had finally stopped living her life on other people's terms. I'd learned that the quietest, most permanent kind of justice wasn't punishment. It was simply allowing truth to exist without interference. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop protecting people from the consequences of their own choices and start protecting yourself from their attempts to diminish yours. In the end, I hadn't destroyed anyone. I just finally stopped destroying myself. If this story of quiet justice had you rooting for Sarah, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Nicole stood up at the gala, knowing exactly what bombshell she was about to drop. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.